Good morning, everybody. It is a great privilege for me to be here to introduce to you the first session of the Saturday program of the New York Encounter, and it's just wonderful to see so many people here, the wonderful volunteers that have made this possible, and to be together again for a year. My name is Paolo Carozza. I'm a professor of law at the University of Notre Dame, and I have the honor this morning of hosting these two guests to help us talk about what we've entitled A Fragment of Being. But really what we're focused on is the memory of the human body and how important that is and how lost in some ways it is in the environment that we're in right now so often. But first let me introduce these wonderful guests that we have. Christine Rosen, here to my left, is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. She focuses there on questions relating to American history, society, technology and culture, and feminism. Her background is as a historian by training with a PhD from Emory University. She's a prolific author of many books, but most recently, and the one that is most relevant to our topic here today, is the book called The Extinction of Experience. Very provocative title. Being Human in a Disembodied World. Our second guest, Carter Snead, my longtime friend from the University of Notre Dame Law School, is the Charles E. Rice Professor of Law there and a concurrent professor of political science. He's one of the world's leading experts on public bioethics. He was the director of Notre Dame's De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, which I think probably learned a few things from the New York Encounter and the meeting in Gemini over the years. He did that for 12 years, and he is the author also of numerous articles and books, but again, one in particular that stands out for our topic today, his 2020 book, which was listed by the Wall Street Journal as one of the best books of the year in any subject. It's called What It Means to Be Human, The Case for the Body in Public Bioethics. So, Christine, Carter, I was so happy to be able to help organize this conversation with the two of you because in the work that I've been engaged in over the last few years in the technology sector, one of the things that has been most striking to me from the start was the sense of this underlying pervasive kind of dualism about the human person that is at the root of so much of what I see historically, looking back decades in this sector. As if the human being is, in some ways, just a disembodied mind, right? And so I'm really sort of eager to understand where this comes from, how it manifests itself in our culture, what some of the implications are of it, and lastly, like, what can we do about it, right? How to respond to it. And both of your books were so striking to me because coming from very different perspectives, different disciplines, academics, more public policy, history, law, and nevertheless, and even different technologies that you're talking about in your two books, nevertheless, you converge around this point about the essential need for remembering the body and embodiment. So why don't we start with just like trying to sorry for the pun, to put some flesh on the problem, and understand, like, what are some of the specific concrete examples or manifestations of the problem of disembodiment or of forgetting the centrality of the human body in the world today that you've written about and that you're worried about and you speak. Why don't we start with you, Christine?
Sure. Thank you, Paolo, and thank you all for being here and to New York Encounter. I would say that the technological mindset that dominates our culture today sees both the human body and human nature and the human person as obstacles to be overcome, problems to be solved, whereas those of us who come from a background of the humanities or faith understand the human person to be embodied at all times. And so from my perspective, the risk that most poses a challenge to us on a daily basis is that the convenience that our technologies offer us, the ease and the efficiency, which we love, whether we want to admit it or not, actually challenge us to think and ignore our bodily signals. We begin to prefer mediated communication to face-to-face communication. We begin to mistrust our own emotional responses to things unless they're reflected on a social media page and we get enough likes for them. So in that sense, we're habituating ourselves to a deeply disembodied way of seeking approval, of understanding the world we live in, and what that's led to, besides higher rates of anxiety and depression among those who most heavily mediate their experience, is a misunderstanding of what we owe each other as human beings, that we owe showing up for people, particularly who are sick or weak or need our help. And I think in very mundane ways, our daily experience has deteriorated because of this mindset, which grew not with any sort of nefarious intent, but over time. Habits of mind that have formed. You step on a subway platform and people are more rude. There seems to be more hostility and anger and impatience. So I think the great challenge ahead is becoming more familiar with what embodied human experience means in terms of our daily behavior as individuals, but more importantly, as members of families and communities.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Carter, public bioethics, very different from just sort of a general cultural critique, but obviously one of the things that's sort of most compelling about your book is the way that you interweave those things, right? That the public bioethical sphere is not divorced from the larger cultural presumptions and attitudes that we have. Where do you see this embodiment manifesting itself concretely in our social life?
Yeah, first of all,
or personal life.
Yeah, no, first I'd like to join Christine in thanking everyone for having us here. It's a very special thing to be at the New York Encounter, especially with my dear friend Christine, who I haven't seen for 20 years, but is amazing.
And yet we haven't aged a day.
Exactly, it's amazing. Neither one of us. It's almost like we don't have bodies. So what I'll say is that in the law, so a lot of people who haven't thought much about law are usually imagine law as separate and distinct from cultural norms or concepts of embodiment or personhood and so on. But in fact, they're deeply intertwined, because what law is for, and this is a broad statement, but I think it's true, is for the protection and promotion of flourishing of persons. That's what law is for. And therefore, law has to operate according to an ex ante or presupposition about what a person is and what about human flourishing is. Otherwise, the law is arbitrary or capricious or worse. And so in the way that Christina was saying, we negotiate our daily lives thinking about who we are and what our flourishing is, and we have these mediated experiences. The law is built on presuppositions, and if the law imagines a person to be merely a disembodied will or an atomized individual will whose highest flourishing is simply to discover the authentic, original truths inside of yourself and to express them and to project a life plan and to follow that life plan, and that is reductively what we are, then the law is going to look a lot different than if we imagine human beings as dynamic psychophysical unities of body and mind, that we don't have bodies, but we are bodies, and we are, as a result, fragile and dependent and vulnerable, and therefore we stand in a particular kind of relationship to one another, one of reciprocal dependence, and what our flourishing requires that the law has to encode and embed, or at least make space for private ordering to take care of. What we need for our flourishing is not simply the freedom of the unencumbered will to do what we want, but rather what McIntyre calls networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving, made up of people who are willing to make the good of others their own good without counting the cost. That's what human beings need to flourish, precisely because we are bodies. To put it more succinctly, because we are living and dying bodies, we are made for love and friendship, and you can know that by thinking about embodied experience. And if you only think of yourself as a disembodied will, not only do you imagine there's no clues to how you should live in nature itself in terms of the configuration of your own body or relationships with the natural world, everything is constructed by you according to your own interior truth. If that's how you see the world, then you can't make sense of fragility or vulnerability, and as Christine said, you can't even see the vulnerable others who have claims on you that aren't a function of contract or consent or some kind of prior agreement. There are people who have claims on us that we don't choose. There are unearned privileges that we have and unchosen obligations that we have. And the only way you can see that in a kind of incarnational way is to understand that we stand in relationships to each other precisely because of our vulnerability, which is a function of our embodiment. And flourishing looks an awful lot different viewed through that lens than it does through the disembodied will anthropology.
Great. That's a great way to start. You mentioned along the way, Carter, living, dying, love, friendship. I mean, any one of those I'd love to hone in on. I'm tempted to talk about AI and romantic relationships in light of the recent statistics of studies that show that the way that as many as 40% of adults in the United States have engaged in some form of interaction with a bot intended to simulate a romantic relationship, which is pretty frightening.
Yeah.
But I'm going to set that temptation aside, having just noted that.
What does that mean for the crowd in the room? What percentage of the...
Look to your left, look to your right.
Somebody's...
But those are bodies, not bots.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to focus in instead, though, on the living and dying part, right? So let's hone in on an example where it really comes to roost these things in concrete ways, culturally as well as politically and legally. What about age and dying, right? I mean, how do you see this disembodiment and this forgetting of this fragment of our being, which is the body, playing out in things like the resistance against aging and how do we treat those who are dying?
Well, I'll give you two brief stories to illustrate the habits of mind we've formed as human beings because of our technologies, and use both of these as an example of why we have to now actively choose the human interaction, because the default is no longer human. So telepresence robots that are used in hospitals, these are sort of robots on wheels, and you slap an iPad on the top of it, and you have a real human person through the screen, a doctor consulting. These can be very useful in rural areas and areas that aren't close to hospitals. But one was used to tell a man that he had terminal cancer. And that's wrong. There is no argument for efficiency or convenience that should lead us to believe that a telepresence robot should ever deliver that news to a human being. Look to care homes, particularly in aging countries such as Japan, where because the young don't feel they have time to spend with their elderly relatives, they've devised robots that look like pet seals or other animals, and they place them on the laps of the older residents, and they can pet the animal, and it gives them, they feel better. And the argument that's always made for these substitutes for human contact are, well, it's better than nothing. And I think our world now requires each and every one of us to say, no, it's not. That's not good enough. And so when we think about the things we're choosing to mediate our obligations, particularly for care for the most vulnerable populations, the elderly, the people who are ill, and children, because these are the populations that our technologists most like to experiment upon, because they are the weaker. They don't have a voice in a lot of these cultural discussions. So I would say those examples, and those are just two, there are many, many more, where we as a culture, again, without thinking through the implications, the ethical choices we're making here, are just assuming that the new thing is the better thing. And in many of these cases, it simply isn't.
Mm. Yeah, listening to you say that, I remember there was a picture during COVID of a person who was dying in the early 2020 or middle of 2020 who was dying, who had no loved ones around. And the staff of the hospital filled a rubber glove with warm water and put it on the person's body to simulate human touch. And it was the most heartbreaking thing I saw during that whole very difficult period that we had. To your question, Paolo, and again, the lens at which I come to this is through public bioethics, which is the governance of science, medicine, biotechnology in the name of ethical goods. So I'm thinking about end-of-life decision-making. Mm-hmm. And you imagine, in order to construct a legal framework which shapes behavior and even shapes opinions through the pedagogical mechanism of the law, teaching us what we should think about such things, not merely reflecting what we think the mechanism of the law actually does teach as well as reflect what a given people think about a particular question. You have to have an image of what the patient is. You have to say what exactly, and you have to be faithful to the patient that you have in front of you right now and all of the complexity that he or she is experiencing in his or her vulnerability. And unfortunately, what becomes the forgetfulness of the body manifest in the end-of-life law comes up by constructing a legal framework that simply exists to maximize autonomy at the end of life. which is in some ways a category mistake when you're talking about a patient who's incapable of making autonomous decisions for him or herself. We're in the midst of experiencing a wave of dementia patients because of aging and the way the shape of life has all changed over time in many respects for the good because of advances in biomedical science and care. There's an enormous and growing population of people suffering from dementia. And of course, there are always people who suffer from other cognitive impairments to make it impossible for them to take care of themselves. And of course, you have children, as you say, who can't make decisions on their own behalf. And so if you're imagining a human being as merely a bundle of desires and willfulness, and you're trying to fit that square into that round hole, you're going to create structures that can't respond to the full neediness of the person in that particular moment. And to take just one small concrete example in the context of assisted suicide, where it's debated and it's a state-by-state question, and different states have legalized assisted suicide. About 10 or 11 states, maybe 12, have legalized assisted suicide. And all of the laws are based on this original statutory framework that Oregon passed in the 1990s. And we know that suicidal ideation is highly correlated with treatable mental illness. A supermajority of people who have suicidal ideation suffer from reversible clinical depression, or at least clinical depression you can treat, especially if you have cancer, which again is a huge percentage of people who make use of assisted suicide. And yet these laws are designed in a way not to require the psychological assessment of people when they get their prescription, and even more importantly, when they self-administer the drugs to take their own life. There's no one there. There's no concern about vulnerable populations like the poor or discrete and insular minorities or the disabled or the elderly. There's an epidemic of elder abuse in the United States right now. And in California, you may recall when they legalized assisted suicide, Jerry Brown, the governor of California, got up and said, in asking myself whether I would sign this into law, I asked, what would I want at the end of my life? And what he was imagining was himself at this moment, privileged, powerful, white, making a decision on his own behalf to write the last chapter of his life. That's not the reality. Most people don't go to the doctor or are agonal in this end stage of their lives seeking to maximize their unencumbered will. They want someone to help them and to take care of them. And he was asking exactly the wrong question. The question isn't what the most powerful governor of California wants at the end of his life. It's what do poor people need? What do the disabled need? What do the elderly need? What do stigmatized minorities need? Because those are the fragile populations owing to their embodiment or socio-cultural circumstances that require not freedom alone, of course they need freedom, but not freedom alone, but also the protection of the law. And that is an example of misunderstanding what a patient is and operating according to an idealized standard, according to a framework which I talk about elsewhere called expressive individualism. We can talk about it later. But it captures what we're all talking about right now, the idea of the disembodied will, the idea of the individual whose highest flourishing is to interrogate the depths of his or her own sensibilities, sentiment, and then follow their original life plan. That's what human life looks like, not the messiness of total dependence and vulnerability. We all begin our lives utterly dependent upon others. We, at the very best case scenario, follow a gentle arc of life upward to the height of our powers, and then immediately pivot backwards, downwards to total dependency again. And expressive individualism only gives an account of the person at the very peak of that arc, and for only the most privileged and powerful.
Great. I love the way that both of you have really brought out in different ways how much the weakest and most vulnerable are the ones who are going to be most directly impacted and affected by these kinds of shifts and distortions of really what constitutes our humanity. But also it strikes me that underlying this, it seems to be there's a very distinctive understanding of what freedom is. That is quite distorted in a certain sense. I mean, what does it mean to be free, and how does that relate to this sense of whether the body is something to be valued and an integral part of who we are ontologically as beings or not, or something that can be separated? What does it do to our sense of freedom? How does a distorted sense of freedom drive this problem, and how does the problem contribute perhaps at a both an individual level and at a cultural level to what our understandings of what it means to be free and a free society? Any thoughts about that?
Well, conceit of the technological project is that you are free in embracing it. And by that I mean that living a lot of your life online in platforms and worlds designed by others to sell you things, to get you to behave in certain ways, to keep you on the platform, that is its only purpose, that's a new and liberating form of freedom. This was the bill of goods that we were all sold when the internet came along. And I think what we have to think about now is, what is freedom for? Because what the technological project wants us to ask is only, what are we achieving freedom from? What things do we dislike as human beings that we'd rather not have to deal with? I'd rather summon a car with the press of a button, never talk to the driver, and be dropped off at my location. I would like to have my food dropped on my doorstep, again, after having summoned it on my phone, never having to look in the eye at the people who prepared it or delivered it. And then I might, if you look at the demographics of our country right now, you'll probably eat it alone while watching other people doing things on a screen. This is a lot of conversation recently has been about the loneliness epidemic, but I think that is misleading. We have an epidemic of self-isolation. We're choosing this. We're choosing to live in a way that we think is freedom, but freedom only can happen and flourish for the most number of people possible if it comes with obligation. And I think what a lot of our technology today, whether it's at the beginning or end of life, and this is certainly true with the technologies related to bioethics and the control of human reproduction, control, power. We assume for ourselves a level of control that is false, because when everything breaks down and your body fails you, you will suddenly have that lesson taught to you in a very harsh way. And you might not have the moral and psychological fortitude to deal with it. I think we are raising generations of people who literally can't look someone in the eye and have a conversation without feelings of great anxiety. And that is not a problem, it's a tragedy for human interaction, because that's not what we're supposed to be doing if we're raising our children and grandchildren in healthy ways. So I would say the conceit of freedom, and look to the rhetoric of the technologists, Mark Andreessen, for example, big venture capitalist, he talks about reality privilege, this idea that if your reality is terrible, don't try to fix it, that's not gonna happen. You can live your life online. You can have freedom and control online in these worlds that give you vastly greater opportunities for creativity and emotional resonance. This is the promise. He's not going to live in that world. He's going to live in his reality, which is quite nice. In fact, he and his friends are building they're building a private city outside of San Francisco where they can all live. More power to him. But the reality that they see for most of the rest of us is one that's deeply unfree. It is designed by others to control others. That's not the freedom that I think we assume we have when we pick up our phones and order something from DoorDash.
Yeah, great examples. I mean, Carter, you've thought a lot, you've talked a lot, even in these comments and in all of your work, you've talked a lot about the centrality of dependence and the recognition of dependence to the human being and to human flourishing. How does that relate to this question of freedom that Christine was just talking about?
Christine, everything Christine said is beautifully said and exactly right. I was imagining what you said also, Christine, the notion of friendship, or of freedom in this technological context, because technological maybe is intrinsically instrumental or something, relates to rational mastery and power. It's the language of freedom is directly related to power and control of your own circumstances. But as we all know, we live in a world interconnected to other people. It's not just it's control over other people as well. There's a kind of instrumental, the world of expressive individualism is not merely a world of collaboration among disembodied wills, it's also a world of strife, where you have to overcome the wills of others to realize what it is that you want to do to build the sort of virtual life that you want to have. And Christine mentioned in that context assisted reproductive technology. So I got to know Christine in the early 2000s when I was working with President's Council on Bioethics with all of our wonderful mutual friends, and we were working on a report called Reproduction and Responsibility, the Regulation of New Biotechnologies. And we asked an expert, I won't name him because I don't want to shame anybody, but we asked this very important expert, scientist, practitioner of assisted reproductive technology, to come and tell us what the kinds of genetic screening for sex selection and trait selection and hair color and eye color and now for IQ, what is all of this for? What is genetic screening for? And of course, there's obviously medical reasons as well. And he had 6 weeks to think about it. He came and sat down in front of our council and to answer the question, what is genetic screening and assisted reproduction for? And he said, it's to help parents realize their dream of a disease-free legacy.
Wow.
That was the phrase. So that's a very specific kind of freedom that he's talking about. The freedom to pursue your dream of a disease-free legacy. Now, the strange irony of that formulation is it had the word parent in it, because a parent is a relational concept. There's no such thing as a parent without a child, or at least a hoped-for child. And that relationship of parent and child, in his framing, is one of instrumentalization, rational mastery, which is not to say, by the way, please do not hear me saying that people who use assisted reproductive technologies come with that perspective. It's not at all the perspective they come to the table with. They come to the table with the perspective of profound vulnerability because their bodies have failed them. Their bodies have failed them in what they most want to be, which is to parent a child of their own flesh and to love a child of their own flesh. But what the law does in the United States, and really the absence of law, is to create a framework in which that profoundly vulnerable group of folks are led into and tempted into making decisions about quality assurance and selection of sex and skin color and eye color and IQ that transforms the relationship between parent and child, which should be the ultimate network of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving between one who is welcomed as Leon Cass said, a child is a mysterious stranger that we welcome and we love unconditionally. A child is a gift that stands in relation to you on equal footing, equal dignity. And if a child is made and not begotten, that distorts the perspective of what a child is. And again, I'm not talking about the perspective of the parents or even the practitioners. I'm talking about the perspective of the law. If the law tells you what a child is as a product, and here we're going to devise a framework that's fit to that arrangement, that's a deep problem because that's not what parents want, that's not what they need, and yet they find themselves without guardrails and without anyone to support them other than this highly commercialized industry that approaches them and offers them all these things. They offers them a disease-free legacy.
Well, and if I could just add, because Carter's making such an important point, the law is doing one thing, the practitioners are sort of trying to offer whatever new latest technology they have on offer, thinking this is the best thing for their patients. And then there are all these social pressures that bubble along underneath all of this, but inform the parents, inform the practitioners, and certainly inform the lawmakers, which is this assumption that this amount of control is fine, but and this is true of all technology, it doesn't tell you what's not on the menu, right? Kids are like, I can get anything on my phone. I'm like, well, look at how this has been structured. What aren't you allowed to choose? So if you're a parent and you go and you say you're a woman who's pregnant and you're above a certain age, and your OBGYN will say, well, you have to have an amniocentesis to check for Downs, for example. And if you don't want to do that, you have to put up a fight. In many cases. So that's not on the menu anymore as a parent. Even if your obligation to your child is regardless of how that child comes into the world, you love it unconditionally, as Carter says. So anytime we embrace these new sort of technological control ways of thinking, we take things off the menu. And many of the things that we've taken off the menu, whether it's with regard to how we build families or whether it's how we just go through our daily lives, has taken those qualitative things off the table. We have a lot of quantitative options, but the moral and ethical responsibilities, the qualitative emotional experiences of helping others and feeling a deep and lovely sense of obligation to others, that's off the menu in a lot of cases. We have to fight for it. We have to demand it now.
And the virtues that you need to flourish as an embodied human being embedded in networks of giving and receiving are missed as well. If you think of life as a consumer, you're not thinking about the virtues of uncalculated giving, just generosity, hospitality, misericordia, which is accompanying others in their suffering as if it's your own suffering, or more importantly, the virtues of graceful receiving, gratitude, openness to the unbidden, tolerance of imperfection. These are all things that are, and again, all these virtues can be understood through the lens of genuine friendship, hoping and seeking the good of the other without counting the cost to yourself. And if you're thinking about everything in your life as a drop-down menu, to order the thing exactly as you want it, and then you're irritated when you get something that you didn't ask for, and DoorDash brings you the wrong thing or doesn't bring the sauce with your burrito or whatever. You know, you have a kid, and this isn't what I hoped for. I was told that my child would have a higher IQ than this. I was told that my child would not have Down syndrome. These are, and already, and again, it's not that that's how parents see the world, and I'm not indicting parents or people. I'm talking about, like, the law pushes you and culture pushes you in a particular kind of mode of thought, and you have to fight it. Like you said, I mean, friends of ours who they decline amniocentesis after they're pregnant after a certain age, and they're like, "What are you, religious?" Mm-hmm. Like that's the question you get. Yes, I mean.
Yeah. So the references that each of you have made, both to this question of quantification and where that fits in, and also to this sort of selecting, choosing, the willfulness of making myself that you're referring to, Carter, leads me to sort of a question that on the surface might appear paradoxical in this discussion. And I want to get at it by asking, like, okay, if we're separating what a human being is in this vision from the body, then what do we do with the body, right? There's a certain paradox in the cultural moment that you're describing, I think, at least that I observe. And that is that at the same time that we're talking about a disembodied worldview and ethos, people are obsessively concerned with their bodies, right? It's all about the quantification of the body. It's all about wellness. It's all about the latest hack that is going to make me live perfectly this particular day in a physical perspective. How does that relate to the underlying problem that you've been diagnosing in your works?
It's a sign of the hollowness of our sense of ourselves, that we seek to cheat death, we seek to cheat aging. It's very popular in Silicon Valley. There are now companies that will argue that you can cheat death. They're trying to find ways to upload consciousness. You never have to really die. There are, in my opinion, quite horrifying apps which will, if a loved one dies, you can give every text message, voicemail, video snippet, and email that person ever wrote, and they will devise a chatbot to talk to you in your dead loved one's voice. Gracious. So this then robs us of the ability to grieve and to understand that there are beginnings and middles and ends, as Carter was saying, not just to the lifespan, but to our own relationships throughout our life. So I would say that it's actually not exactly a contradiction or a paradox. It's a sign of hunger for meaning and purpose. So you think about these young people who spend a lot of time on Instagram, and there's this weird little phenomenon where they filter their faces so much before they post their picture that when they look in an actual mirror, they're almost unrecognizable to themselves. So it's not even the mirror of Narcissus, which was the original concern with a lot of social media. It's a strange sort of emptiness of self. Like, I don't recognize myself. So that, to me, is a much more concerning problem down the line, because a sense of selfhood, a real grounding in community and in the physical body are all interlinked. If you remove one piece of that puzzle, you get people who become very confused about who, not just where they belong in the world, but who they actually are. What is their purpose? Why are they on Earth? So I'm sounding quite existential at this moment. I apologize at the first panel, and I'm going really dark. But I do think, again, all these little, it's not just one thing. It's not, and so, which unfortunately means there's not just one simple solution. But there is a way in which we need to reframe our understanding, not just of ourselves and individualism and the opportunities, freedom, and community, but the habits of mind we form on a daily basis that lead to expectations about ourselves and others. And for that, if you spend 8 hours a day staring at a screen, that's how you form your habits.
If I can jump in for just a second before turning it back, the same question back to you, Carter. Christine, probably the first thing that grabbed me about your book and then made me know that I wanted to read it was the title itself.
It's very portentous.
The extinction of experience and the reference to experience in it, right? And I just want to highlight that because in the comments that you made right now, you really bring out that the question of experience is a question of meaning, and not just of things happening to us in an external way. And so this question of how the disembodied life is a reduction of the meaning of our daily existence and the capacity to grasp that meaning in its fullness seems to be really at the very heart of what we're talking about today. Carter?
Yeah, no, I agree. It's what you're talking about, Narcissus. I was thinking, before when you were talking, I was thinking about the lotus eaters and sort of narcotizing yourself and being happy. If your reality is terrible, then just opt out. Virtual reality and so on. But, so the body it's interesting. It is paradoxical because when you think about embodiment and you think about the relationship between embodied exertion and work and the consequences of work and how that actually enhances a person's, in a positive sense, a person's understanding of flourishing and identity and disentangling work and embodied exertion from outcomes, like when you use anabolic steroids or something like that, has the opposite. It has a kind of disembodying effect, even though it takes place in the locus of the body. It's not you, right? So there's a real salutary effect living in the world of experience, doing Aikido, like mowing the lawn, whatever, like actually living as a body can remind us about our fragility and vulnerability and interdependence. But what you're asking about, Paolo, is something different, and I wonder, and Christine knows a lot more about this than I do, but like this obsession with focusing on the body and its appearance, is that a kind of curation for a virtual audience more than for the sake of I'm flourishing as an organism, right? Like I'm strengthening myself, I'm becoming stronger and healthier and so on. And so the deep problem is if you view the world through the lens of expressive individualism, in which you are a disembodied radical will, it's dualistic, like it's my mind and my will and my desire is me and everything else is instrumental, then your body becomes a pure instrument to the realization of the projects of the will also. In the same way that your relationships become instrumental, including familial relationships. The dream of a disease-free legacy, for example. Or when your relationship with your grandma, who's elderly and frail, becomes an obstacle to the realization, then that's something that you don't, or your wife or your husband, you know, these relationships, this collaborative relationship end through the vision of expressive individualism. And so my view is that the paradox isn't a paradox if you think of the body as a mere instrument and expression of the will itself, and especially in these virtual spaces that Christine knows so much about. Instagram, I'm probably like old. It's probably something newer than Instagram. But in any event, the idea being that if we think of the body as us, then you have a very different relationship to exertion and self-improvement than if you think of the body as a palette on which you're constructing your original authentic truths that you then display to your virtual audience.
Well, and there is an irony there, right? Because if you think about how people are constantly presenting their self and tweaking their appearance to look exactly like they expect others to like, because other people have liked someone who looks like this, that's why every single actor and actress in Hollywood is starting to look the same. It has a homogenizing effect. It's not radical individualism, even though we're like, I'm in control, I can do whatever I want to myself. Everybody ends up looking like the same version of a bot. It's very strange.
And it comes back to the question of freedom then, right?
My wife was telling me there's a thing called Mar-a-Lago face. That
it's real.
All these, it has to do with cosmetic surgery, and like that all these people, men and women, end up looking like, and it's totally, it's weird. It's like they're wearing a mask. It's homogenized.
Yeah. Well, we could go on a long time more diagnosing other areas. I'd love to talk about education, for example. But in the interest of time, and the interest of not getting everybody started only on the dark side. No, that's right. I mean, we have to begin with realism, right? But we're also enjoined to hope. And you know, as that beautiful introductory video showed us and urged upon us, here can begin a new life, right? And part of that is remembering the body. In the literal etymological sense, remembering, right? Remembering, bringing the body back together, giving it flesh, making it part of the unity of who we are as human beings. Where do we begin to do that? Like, where do we resist this? How do we address this at a personal and a cultural level? What can we begin to do in a community and in our own lives, in our families and our relationships, to overcome this pull towards dismemberment of our very selves?
So at the individual level, you always choose the human. Choose the face-to-face. Embrace the idea that this will be inconvenient and annoying, and you have to put on clothes and pants and get out of the house and go see your friend. And wish them happy birthday to their face, not just because Facebook reminded you it was their birthday. That's really difficult, and that means parents, when you're pushing your kid in the stroller, don't be looking at your phone. Talk to your child, even if your child is pre-verbal, and just grunting and pointing at trees. These daily moments are the building blocks of human interaction, and it's how we train each new generation to to understand how to be human. I mean, basically, for those of you who have kids, you know, preschool isn't going to teach your kid to read. It's going to try to civilize these little tyrants who are, you know, adorably focused on dominating any space they're in their charming way. So we have to do that at the individual level. But at the level of society and culture, we do need to start asking some tougher questions of ourselves. And this is where the law, and I think Carter would agree, I mean, in bioethics, there's plenty of room for greater regulation of these things. We need to protect kids right now.
Yeah.
And so although I'm a free market, a fan of the free market and entrepreneurialism, when it comes to our children, if we know there's something harming them, we change the law to protect them. And we need to do that with things like social media platforms that were designed for adults, but are in use by 8 and 9 and 10-year-olds. So I think there is a way in which culture and law can work together, and you can have top-down solutions, but also ground-up solutions. Schools that are going cell phone free are another example of this, where parents are demanding it, teachers want it. I'll give you one little glimpse of, I have 2 Gen Z sons, they're in college now, and there's a thing that they do when they go out, you know, none of them have any money, they're college students, so if they go to some place for dinner, everybody's supposed to pay their own way. But sometimes they'll all put their cell phones in the center of the table. And anyone who picks up the phone has to pay the entire bill.
No.
That's a good
So
Fantastic.
they are lashing themselves to the mast because they understand the appeal of
Back to the
that
Odyssey.
device. So that, to me, is a beautiful example of hopefulness. They have been raised in a culture where their expectations have been formed by something that they now understand to be potentially harmful, and they're trying to find ways around that. So at all those levels, I think we have to just have more awareness and thoughtfulness about the world we want to live in, not just the one that we happen to be living in now.
Yeah, that's really great. It's funny because expressive individualism can't make sense of children. It imagines children to be just little adults. You want to maximize the autonomy of the little adult, and that's, anybody who's ever been around a child understands that's not at all. It's funny, I was just thinking about my almost 3-year-old, his name is Giovanni Battista, we call him Gigi or Baby G, and he says, he'll grab something and he'll say, "Mein bottle," and I'm like, what? And I'm like, why are you speaking German, first of all? It just, bet domination sounds better in German, maybe? I don't know, but in any event, But back to the question that you asked, Paolo. In the law, and those of us, we tend to think about grand solutions and like how can we engender an anthropology of embodiment in the culture through law. And I do believe that law and politics shape culture for sure. But that temptation in some ways needs to be resisted because the real answer is the only way that you can recover this is by loving the person who's right in front of you. Unconditional love, self-emptying love for the person that presents him or herself to you right now, and responding to them in their embodiment and as a gift, as a person to be cared for, not as a project or part of my narrative to plug into something. And so you think about these radical acts of hospitality, and I think about Mother Teresa. You know, she says the reason that we have so much trouble in the world is because we've forgotten that we belong to one another. And the idea of belonging to one another, even people, it takes some moral imagination to understand how you belong to people that you don't know, or that you see lying on the street, or that you see in a wheelchair, or someone that doesn't look like you. But it seems to me that for our part, in order to recover the genuine vision of friendship and embodied love and friendship and hospitality, is through the practice of it. And as exactly what Christine said, it's like, it's in your interpersonal relationships. It's, talk to somebody, interact with somebody, give somebody a hug with their permission. But also, it's about living in the world and interacting with those that are immediately put in front of you. Yes, grand strategy. Yes, we should think and talk about an anthropology of embodiment in our politics, and when we debate and deliberate over regulatory frameworks or statutes or whatever, we should be mindful of the reality of what a human being is and what human flourishing is. But there's no mercy at a distance. You have to make a choice to live in an embodied life in exactly the beautiful way that Christine put.
Can I add?
Please.
A lot of the people who, certainly I will only speak for the technologists whom I've studied out in Silicon Valley, they claim to love humanity, but they actually don't like people.
Right.
And so always having that distinction in mind as we use the things they create for us should be helpful.
So I want to flip the same question from a different angle, though, right? Because I don't understand from your books and from our conversations and everything else you've done that either of you are opposed to technology as such, right? And I want to be clear that this isn't a screed against technology and the use of technology and the importance of technology in our lives. We are, human beings are as much meaning seekers as we are tool users. That's always been true, and the technology always changes us and changes our society. So if we think about it as a question of how should we affirmatively relate to technology, instead of thinking about what kinds of constraints should we put on technology, how would we think about it? Like, what are the ways in which our attitude and our relationship to the technology in our lives could be transformed or made different in a way that doesn't stunt or atrophy this more integral sense of humanity that we're struggling with right now?
Okay, don't laugh, but we should be more Amish. Keep your zippers.
We love
lady.
technology.
Yeah, don't become Amish, but be like the Amish. And by that I mean, no, we shouldn't stop the incredible entrepreneurial development of a lot of these things which are going to save lives. And this is even in the case of things like AI, which right now one of the most amazing breakthroughs is helping radiologists better read scans and finding illness in a way that the human eye can't. These are remarkable things. These are examples of human ingenuity. When it comes to the most intimate spaces in our lives, our actual physical bodies and those of our loved ones, however, we need to ask some very pressing questions about every new thing, because Americans love our new stuff, right? We have an almost religious-like fervor when it comes to technology, and historically this has long been the case. What the Amish do before they embrace a new technology of any sort is go through a list of their values. How will this change the way we interact at home in the evenings? Well, the telephone will bring conversation into the home with more people, but then we won't leave the house to talk to them either. So let's put the telephone outside of the home. We don't need electric light because there's a kind of community we have at the end of the day after a hard day's work that suits our values and our morals, and so we don't need that. But they ask the question. We don't. And I know you didn't want to talk about education, but I see this especially in education, where every new technological tool is offered to teachers in classrooms, and they say, oh, you'll have a little AI bot that'll track in real time each student's progress and help them. And that seems really neat. But what are we not asking about that? What will that take away in terms of a teacher's face-to-face interaction and what they can pick up on a student? What data is being, that might compromise a child's privacy? What does that look like? But at the end of the day, we have to ask the question, what is this replacing? Because in some sense, it is a zero-sum game. I don't like to see the world that way, but when it comes to technology, one thing replaces the other. The car replaced the horse and carriage, and now none of us need a buggy whip. Fine, we've embraced that. But I don't ever want to see a world where my smartphone FaceTime conversations replace going and visiting my elderly neighbor who just needs some human companionship. I could do it on FaceTime, but it's better to take the trip out into the real world in my physical body and sit with her. So that's where I think we are hesitant, because we love the ease and the convenience and the efficiency of all these devices, not to ask those tougher questions. Look, we'll ask them about nuclear power and AI, but ask them about what's the first thing you touch in the morning and the last thing you touch at night. For many people, it's their phone. Yeah. So we need to ask if that's the world we want to live in, because that's something I think the Amish and other very more isolated communities, that's just how they do things. So we can learn from that in terms of building worlds that reflect our values.
Fantastic. Carter, last word?
I, as usual, I agree with Christine. So I'll make it concrete in the context of assisted reproductive technologies, for example. What do you ask? The question asked is, what are parents and children? And how can we serve a relationship that is characterized by uncalculated giving and graceful receiving, and that holds intact and with integrity the vision of a child as a mysterious stranger that you welcome and love unconditionally, that a child is a gift and not a product and not a project. And then when we ask ourselves, when we're presented with new forms of assisted reproductive technologies, we ask, how does that add to or take away from that vision of what parents are and should be? How does it threaten the goods the human goods that we most care about? and we analyzed. So if you're asked, like, how about a technology that predicts the IQ of this embryo versus that embryo, and we're going to destroy and literally end the lives of those embryonic human beings who fall below the threshold of IQ, or they're not a preferred sex, or whatever. Like, how does that choice, how does that technology relate to the proper relationship between parents and children, what a parent is and what a child is? And that should inform our judgment about how we support those technologies or not.
Fantastic. There's so much more that I want to ask you, so much more to explore. I'm sure that's true of our audience too. The good news is that both Christine and Carter will be available afterwards at the Human Adventure Books table, starting at now, I think, to sign copies of their books, and you can explore a lot of the issues in those as well. I'll also just close by saying that conversations like this happen because the New York Encounter is just such an amazing and unique event. But it only continues if we are all a part of it. So please be generous with your donations. Outside, there's a place where you can do that. You can also do it online through the newyorkencounter.org/donate website. Please be as generous as you can on that. But for now, unfortunately, I have to bring this wonderful conversation to a close. Please help me in thanking our guests today.
Thank you.